Good evening, everyone, and we are live for some AP Government Review. Now, this is an annual tradition that I started with HipHughes a few years ago, the night before the AP Government exam. HipHughes was not able to join us tonight, so the fellowship is breaking, ladies and gentlemen, for hopefully some of y'all have seen Lord of the Rings, right? But at the same time, I do have Paul Sargent with me, who's got his own YouTube channel, so y'all want to make sure to check out Paul Sargent's reviews for AP Government, and he'll be joining me this evening. We were going to be joined by Mr. Peter Paccone from LA, and if you're in Mr. Paccone's class, we want to thank him. He's going to be hanging around in the chat, kind of seeing what people are talking about and asking about there, and directing some things to us. He may be answering questions in the chat. Now, as far as answering questions during this thing, I'm going to be taking questions primarily through Twitter. Okay, so let me go ahead and make sure that everybody understands how to ask questions. Let me look at this real quick. Let's see, AP Government. Okay. All right. So with that, okay, so let me go ahead and go into Twitter here. And let's see. Okay, so my Twitter is at Tom Richey. Okay, at TomRichey. Okay, and so that's going to be how to ask questions. Now, Mr. Paccone's also going to be monitoring the chat a little bit, but make sure now also if you're not following me on Twitter, it's not set up for me to see your questions. So you would follow, then ask a question. Now, also, we want to note here that my app company, Romulus, has a government trivia app. Now, I will tell y'all that we have not recalibrated it for the redesign. So some of the court cases in the app may not be part of your 15 court cases, but the general app, it's only $3.99 at the App Store and at Google Play. So it's something that certainly could not hurt you. It's not like this redesigned exam is testing completely different content. Okay, so as far as political beliefs and behaviors, party identification, executive, legislative, judicial branch, the Constitution, for $2.99, it is something that I think would be a good app, just making sure that you know the vocabulary and all of that. So I would say that Romulus AP Government Review, it is available at the App Store, and also it's available on Google Play. And at each store, $2.99, and I think it would be a handy tool just for you to review, even right before the exam, as you're, if you're not driving, if someone else is driving you, if you're on your way, as you're waiting to take the exam, it's right there on your phone asking you trivia questions. So something that you should definitely think about taking a look at in terms of something that could help you there. Okay, so as far as that goes, this one going into the coattail effect. So just something to get that vocabulary in front of you. I would definitely recommend Romulus AP Government Review, as does my friend Mr. Betts' class. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Sargent and I are going to be answering questions. On Twitter, I'm at Tom Richey. On Twitter, Paul Sargent is P. Sargent. Okay, so that is P. Sargent. You can also ask Paul questions or tag us both. Okay, so as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to go ahead and start looking for answers to questions. All right, so as far as that goes, shout out to Mr. Walton from Kentucky. Okay, so Corinne wants to know pluralism, hyperpluralism, and elitism. How important are those for the exam? Now, I would say that those are very important. Those are theories of democracy. Okay, so when we think about how democracy works, there are these three theories. Okay, so first of all, there is elite theory. And elite theory is saying that, no matter what, really, that even though people technically get to vote, the elites really control everything. That democracy, as we know it, is really kind of a sham, a dog and pony show. That it's really the elites that still continue to control everything. And so going from that, then you've got pluralism and hyperpluralism. Paul, I'm going to go ahead and pass this to you so that you can go ahead and get some screen time here. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Sargent, who's got his AP Government Review bit by bit, that's available here on YouTube for those of you who are in a binge watching mood tonight, but not too late because your exam's at 8 o'clock in the morning.
All right. Well, hey, Tom. So pluralism is kind of what James Madison was referring to, and when he wrote in Federalist Number 10, which is one of those foundational documents that you need to know, when he wrote in Federalist Number 10, that this is a situation where people get to involve themselves in government, and there's a separation of powers. There's a division of powers from the state and the national level, and that gives everybody so many avenues to approach the government that all of these different opinions will show up, making it impossible for sort of one group, like an elite group, to take over government completely. And a pluralist society is sort of like the ideal, that everybody has a way to get their point across, and if enough people want something, then government will respond to it. But hyperpluralism is like the belief that the pluralist ideal has gone like haywire. In other words, there are so many avenues to government: state, local, national. There's legislative branches at state and national levels. There are executive branches at state and national levels. That there are too many avenues, and so there's too many voices attacking too many avenues. And every time a voice doesn't get heard in one avenue, they try and attack for another. So if they don't get what they want from Congress, then they'll try and talk to the president. And if the president doesn't give them what they want, then maybe they'll take something to court. And if the courts don't like what they want, then maybe they'll try and attack something as it's being implemented in the bureaucracy. And thus, really, two things can happen in hyperpluralism. Either you have a government that does nothing because they just get into gridlock with all these ideas, or you have a government that tries to cater to every single need by just trying to get votes by passing stuff, and then you get a lot of laws that get really confusing. So which one of these theories is it? I don't know. Any day.
Yeah, and Paul, I think you hit on something great, that it's like pluralism and hyperpluralism are really kind of the same thing, but just viewed from a beneficial or not beneficial perspective. Now, Paul mentioned Federalist 10, which is one of your core documents. And there are a couple of things about Federalist 10, okay, that first of all, we need to think about that the Federalist Papers, Federalist 10 and 51 by Madison, and Federalist 70 and 79 by Hamilton, these were answers to the anti-Federalist, okay? So Brutus number 1. When you read Brutus number 1, now, of course, his pseudonym, basically this, the guy that stabbed Caesar, one of the guys, et tu, Brute, that what they're doing here is the anti-Federalists cast the Constitution as a dictatorship, that what's going to happen here is that this is these monarchists, these elites who are trying to use the Constitution to take control of people and roll back all of the democratic gains and Republican gains that we've gotten from the Constitution. So, for example, Brutus specifically calls out the federal judiciary. He says that if the Constitution's ratified, this federal judiciary is going to strike down state laws. Well, that's actually happened. So the thing is that the anti-federalists, we need to remember that the anti-federalists had a lot of warnings that a lot of these things ended up coming true, that there's validity. Remember, the Constitution was the result of a compromise between the Federalists and the anti-federalists. The Bill of Rights was really kind of the anti-federalist contribution to the Constitution, which protected the rights of individuals and the states. But Brutus was a head-on assault on the Constitution as dangerous. And so Madison in Federalist 10 is saying that no, it's not just one faction of people's gonna take over. And Madison writes about large republics versus small republics. Okay, so that's one of the things about Federalist 10 is that basically the anti-federalists said that republicanism can only exist in a small republic, because look at Rome, for example. When Rome was small, they were a republic, but when they grew, then it became an empire. It became a dictatorship. And so the anti-federalists said that we cannot have a large republic, that it will be dominated by a group of elites. And that's where Madison in Federalist 10 is saying that No, there can't be, because in a large republic, you can't have one faction dominant. In a small republic, like a state, you can very easily have one faction take control of the government. And if you think about that, even President Trump in his first 2 years, when he had his own party in control of the Senate and the House, wasn't able to get the amount of wall money that he wanted. So even with the two-party system, we do see that, one faction is not able to take total control of the government. Now, hyperpluralism, that is where, and Mr. Paccone was noting that this is on nearly every exam. This is something that is, that comes up. Hyperpluralism is complaining about pluralism. That basically, as far as that goes, that hyperpluralism is where we think that it's not a good thing that there's so much competition between factions. So, for example, if, when we look at the gun debate, okay, where there are people who want more gun control and they're frustrated because what happens is you've got the gun rights lobby and the gun control lobby, and they cancel each other out, okay, so that nothing gets done. So when you're talking about hyperpluralism, it's just there's so much, there are so many competing groups that you can never really legislate in the common interest, because this group over here and this group over here is never going to let anything happen. And we want to shout out to Nate Kovsek, okay, Nate Kovsek. Nate, you've got powerful friends, and so we want to go ahead and shout out to Nate because he knows important people in the Tom Richey world. All right, so as far as that goes, so Nate, I hope you do very well on your government exam tomorrow. So Federalist 10, remember factions and the idea that we can have a large republic, okay, that's not only possible but beneficial, and he's answering the anti-federalist. Now, the thing is, Paul, I would say that while we're on the Madisonian Federalist Papers, we address Federalist 10. You want to go ahead and give us Federalist 51?
Well, Federalist 51 is sort of it's a justification for the way that, or an explanation of the way that power is separated. Again, if you go back to Brutus 1, they are really concerned, the anti-federalists, about an overreach of federal power. And the one thing that Tom pointed out a lot of the really good arguments there, but the one thing I would add is that they point to the legislature as having that elastic clause, that necessary and proper clause, which is the end of all of their powers listed in the Constitution, as being something which could be very problematic. It says Congress has the power to make any laws necessary and proper to carry out its duties. And like, what's necessary, what's proper, was the Brutus argument. And so there was this fear in Brutus 1 that the legislative branch could also take over a whole great deal of power. So in Federalist 51, James Madison goes through and talks about how by separating power out, it will reduce the ability of one group to dominate other groups. And as he put it, people are necessarily going to try and get power. If people were angels, he said, we would need no government. And so what you do in a separation of powers, where you give different powers to each branch of government, and then you balance those with checks on each other's power, is that you pit, as he put it, ambition against ambition. So you want ambitious, power-hungry people in office because they're going to try and take power from other power-hungry, ambitious people in office. And that competition will in itself lead to good outcomes. And so Federalist 51 is talking about this design, which is throughout the Constitution, but is, I think if you read the Constitution, is a little bit hard to kind of get your head around until someone explains it.
All right, and excellent. So yeah, so Federalist 51 about the separation of powers, checks and balances. Okay, we'll get to the Hamiltonian numbers sometime in this hour. I think we will look at those. All right, so gerrymandering and redistricting cases. Okay, so gerrymandering and redistricting. As far as that goes, we've got Paul, these two cases on our top 15. So AP, government, and politics. politics. All right. So first of all, we've got Baker versus we've got Baker versus Carr. Okay. Now, Paul, I don't want to throw out of the 15 cases, Baker versus Carr and Shaw versus Reno to me are like the most obscure. I don't want to just throw these at you without any prep. If you want any of them, let me know.
No, I'll take them. I mean,
okay. So as far as the gerrymandering and redistricting cases, that Baker versus Carr and Shaw versus Reno, Paul's gonna take a stab at this.
Yeah, I'm just trying. I always like to refer back, since it's our first year with the new rewrite, new redesign, just to look through and see exactly what they're looking at. So, so here's the basic about redistricting, gerrymandering, reapportionment. It's a very complicated situation, but basically, representation in the House of Representatives is based on population. Every state gets one representative. So of the 435 that are there, every state gets one. That's 50. And then the question is, how do you divvy up the other 385? And it's based on the census. And so when the census numbers come in, then Congress looks and says, like, okay, which states have grown quicker than others, and do we need to shift representatives around? They do, and then they send that new number or the same number to the states, and the states then have to go about, and they have to divide their state up into districts, and you could have a very easy job like the people from South Dakota who say, hey, we've got one representative, so the whole state's a district, we're done. Like, that's a 5-minute thing. The people from California have a much harder time because they have 53 congressional districts, and they have to really divide things up. But they have to draw it down so like they know exactly what street divides which districts. And when they do that, the party in power, Republicans or Democrats, will always try to draw those lines in order to make things beneficial for themselves. They're going to try and make it so that they have the greatest chance of winning the most districts that they possibly can. That's all part of the game. That's redistricting.
And you have to try to make it not look obvious, right? That's the whole trick. Yeah,
and up until like last year, it's been like you can go really far with the redistricting. When it's done for political purposes, it's referred to as gerrymandering. But gerrymandering itself is not illegal, right? What becomes a problem, or I guess not illegal, not unconstitutional. It is fine. But now we have this new idea of sort of over gerrymandering. And what's happened in the last year or so has been sort of like an extension of these two court cases, which concern this process. I would say with Baker v. Carr and with Shaw v. Reno, like take them down to their very base and get that in your head so that you understand what they're about. Baker versus Carr is built off the idea that every district must be drawn in a way that people have equal representation. There's one man, one vote. There has to be kind of equal population, and it has to be drawn equally so that everybody has an equal chance of voting. Shaw v. Reno then went out and looked and addressed problems that were being done with districting lines that were based on, or that seemed to be based on, because no one would ever admit to this, race. And it made it unconstitutional to gerrymander based on race. Now, for the longest time, like, that was the end of it. But it was just last spring when the Pennsylvania redistricting from 2012, was declared an unconstitutional over gerrymandering, where the Republican Party in California made the lines too complicated, made the districts too unusual in order to win too many seats. And that was then overturned by the state Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear the case. And so for this past election here in Pennsylvania, they did a very quick redistricting, redrew the whole state, and bam, then ran an election based on that. As a result of that, I had a different congressman than I did before.
And so, so the thing is, now I've had a hard time like differentiating Baker versus Carr from Shaw versus Reno. And it was a couple weeks ago when I was tutoring one of my clients. What I thought about with Baker v. Carr, like basically Tennessee, I believe, had not redistricted when populations had shifted. So some districts, like the rural districts, were getting more representation per capita than the urban districts. Now, the urban districts that's also where you've got your minority voters. And so the Supreme Court said here that, like, when I think Baker versus Carr, all the cookies have to be baked the same size. Like all the cookies have to be the same size. And so when you think about this, that every district must have, the same number, about the same number of people. So the whole one man, one vote, or in the 21st century, one person, one vote principle. So that, all of our districts are the same size in population. Now, as far as that goes too, that another thing about Baker is it was the first time where the Supreme Court said that districting is not just a political question. Remember, in Federalist 78, Alexander Hamilton writes about the independent judiciary and how, the judiciary should not get involved in political questions. So if it's a political question, the court should not get involved. But the court's saying in Baker that it is a political question. Now, the Shaw versus Reno, this is what you're seeing here. This was North Carolina. They drew one majority minority district. And then they were told by the Justice Department, you've got to create a second majority minority district. And then you look at this, and this is really all it is like, when Paul's writing, talking about the roads, is all we've got here is like basically, okay, well, here's an interstate highway that connects this predominantly black area, then to this predominantly black area. And so it's very obvious that the only thing about this district is putting together predominantly black areas. And this is where the Supreme Court said, kind of like if you think about like, Bakke versus California is not on your list of cases, but the idea when the court addresses affirmative action, that it can be like affirmative action can be something that's used in college admissions processes, but there can't be a quota. And similarly, when you look at this, it's just, this is so obvious. Okay. So when we look at South Carolina, congressional districts. Okay. So when we look at my home state of South Carolina, that what we see here is we've got 7 congressional districts. Now you can see where there are, some of these districts are very straightforward. So if you look at the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, the 7th district, you see that those are very straightforward. Now then we have the 6th district, which you can see has a little bit of a strange shape to it. So this is obviously, as far as here we have this is the majority minority district. Okay, so here is a predominantly black area of Columbia. Then for the 2nd district, let's bring in this predominantly white area. And then here, let's bring in a predominantly white area here, so that the 6th district is majority minority. But now notice that, the Supreme Court said that's fine. A state should make sure that all of its constituencies are represented. But remember that in the creation of majority minority districts, it's creating a black Democratic district, but then also it's ensuring that every other district will be Republican. Now, right now, the 1st district, is represented by a moderate Democrat, but that probably won't keep up. In most cases, in South Carolina, you've got 6 Republicans and 1 Democrat as a result of this. But again, in Shaw versus Reno, the Supreme Court didn't say that you can't make a majority minority district, but you can't make it this obvious. Okay, that's that can be a problem there. Okay, so going into, let's see, all right, and the checks and balances. Okay, so Paul, let's go ahead and get into checks and balances. Maybe a few examples that they might be able to use tomorrow on the exam.
Okay, well, checks and balances is simply the idea that every branch of government has certain powers of its own, and that stop other branches of government from being able to do things. And really, for any branch of government to get something done, it has to kind of be in compliance with other branches. That doesn't mean it's always has to be okayed by other branches, but other branches have the power to stop each branch from doing kind of like whatever it wants. Now, I don't care what textbook you look at or what website you want to look at. Every single one of them, if you look up checks and balances, has some sort of diagram, typically like a triangle. 3 branches of government at the corners, and then ways that they check each other. So an example of each. Congress can check the power of the judicial branch by creating a new law. If the judicial branch declares a law unconstitutional or part of a law unconstitutional, Congress can pass the same law with slightly different wording or slightly different modifications in order to get around that kind of that unconstitutionality. Congress can check the power of the president by maybe not passing a law that he wants to see done, or by passing a law that overrides an executive order, or by simply refusing to fund the implementation of an executive order that the president wants. The president has checks over the other 2 branches, largely over the judicial branch, because the president is in charge of enforcement of the court decisions. The court doesn't have its own army or police force or anything like that. And so presidents in the past have simply refused to implement rulings by the Supreme Court. The president also has checks over Congress, the most notable of which is the veto. Congress can go through a very long negotiation process and can come up with lots of great stuff. We saw this happen with the border wall funding. Congress got all together and had a deal for a budget put together, and then the president vetoed it, and that killed the whole thing. And then when it comes to the court's real power over the other branches is its power of judicial review. It can declare a law passed by Congress as unconstitutional, and it can declare an act by the president, an executive order, something like that, as unconstitutional. And so every branch is there to sort of check the power of the branches around it. What it's supposed to create is a system whereby there's a conversation that goes on among branches before things are done. So ideally, if Congress is going to pass a law, they're gonna have a chat with the president to see if it's something that the president's going to go along with. Because if the president's going to veto it, then you're going through a fairly academic exercise. Also, you might want to talk to some lawyers to see whether there's precedent for the Supreme Court overturning a law. Not that they talk directly to the Supreme Court, but you can kind of predict what they might do. And so that kind of conversation is what it's meant to create. But it also creates a situation where branches of government try and do things for political purposes. So Congress may pass a law knowing the president will veto it, but rather than going and changing the law ahead of time, they're going to put the president in the position of having to veto a law which may be very popular with the people. And that puts the president in a bad situation. Likewise, the president may let the Supreme Court rule on something, and then, as I said, refuse to enforce it and make a public display of that for political support from his voters. So separation of powers, key concept here.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, let's give a quick shout out to Adam Pinkerton and his friends, Hannah, Andrew, Devin, and Hannah, who are watching on a Sunday in their classroom. Okay, so glad to, okay, so yeah, Mr. Pinkerton's class. Okay, good to see y'all here. And Ty has a question about the letter from Birmingham Jail, okay, which of course, the letter from Birmingham Jail is kind of an outlier when you look at like the founding documents. Like all of the other documents are either the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation or the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist Papers. Okay, so then there's the letter from Birmingham Jail in the 20th century, and the letter from Birmingham Jail is a bit different because it's not trying to explain the Constitution, and it's not really trying to explain the American system of government. That Martin Luther King Jr., when he was in the Birmingham Jail, he was responding to a letter from what seemed to be some well-meaning white ministers. That it wasn't that these people were hostile to him, but they said, you should be trying to just go through the courts. Okay, all of this coming into Birmingham, and you're coming in here, you are ruffling feathers, and it's really making the situation worse rather than better. So we should just try to let the courts take care of this. And so Martin Luther King wrote in response to these people, it's like, how long am I supposed to wait? That the courts, they are working, at this slow pace, and, that if there's an unjust law, this is where his whole focus on civil disobedience, that if a law is unjust, then a citizen has a duty to disobey it. Now, to pay the consequences, that's why he was in the Birmingham Jail, but has a duty to disobey it. And so that's where where the letter from Birmingham Jail comes in, is this idea of not just the Constitution and how our government is set up, but what other recourse does the citizen have if there is a law that that goes against what they feel are fundamental principles of justice. Okay, so that's really where this is coming in response to the others. Okay, so it's a bit different in that sense, because he's not trying to explain the Constitution, but to say, like, this is why I'm not just relying on the legal system and the judicial system. Now, with that, we might want to go into the situation. Now, before we do that, Paul, Emma wants us to explain grants.
Grants. Oh boy, this is fun stuff. All right, so hey, grants are a part of the Federalist system, where power is divided between the national and the state governments. Grants are part of sort of modern day federalism. Modern day federalism is a realization that there is definitely a division of power. However, states don't have the resources to be able to do the things that they'd like to do equally. Some states have more tax money, some states have less tax money, some states need to spend more tax money, and the tax money is, and I talk about money a lot with this because that's really the issue in most of these cases. The money isn't necessarily equal or proportional to the number of people in the state. Some states are generally wealthier than others, and some states tend to spend their money on different things. There are different climates. There's different, states have different stuff that they got to worry about. And so what the grant system does is it allows the federal government to give money to the states to help them do the things that they're trying to do. And that is not only sort of a federal sort of blending of responsibility with states, but it also tries to kind of even things out a little bit. And so what you get when you talk about grants is you really get two types of grants typically. One is categorical grants. The federal government will give money for a certain particular type of spending. These can be like social programs, for example. If they're going to put in money for the free and reduced lunch program at schools. Well, it's dependent on how many kids are qualified for the free and reduced lunch program. And so it's for a particular category. The other kind of grant, which gives a lot more leeway to the states, is a block grant, where a sum of money is given to states, and then they have a lot more leeway on how to spend it. It might be, let's say, for infrastructure, and one state may say, hey, you know what, we really need to put some money into roads this year, and another state may say, hey, you know, most of our roads are okay, but our bridges are starting to really crumble. So they have the authority to kind of move that around and use it as they will. Both of these, though, are used not only to help states, but also at times they're used by the federal government to kind of force states to do things that the federal government wants them to do. Whether that's follow certain hiring practices, or whether it's to change their own laws. The classic example of that is when the federal government withheld federal highway funding from states if the states refused to raise their drinking age from 18 or whatever it was in the state to 21. Once they raised it to 21, here's your money for your roads. If you don't raise it to 21, pay for your own roads. And every state has the drinking age at 21. So,
and yeah, that's the way that the federal government uses grants to kind of get around federalism, because I mean it's just this almost like a scam that like they take money from people in the states and they're like, if you want that money back, then you have to do this and this and this. Same for like federal control over education. So when you think about like any federal education law, that if a state said that we're not going to take any federal dollars, that state would not be subject to any federal regulations of their education system. But we have yet to see a state that's decided that they would rather have the drinking age lower, or they would rather have control over their education system rather than get that federal money. So yes, the federal government definitely uses grants for those purposes. Now, as far as that, we want to shout out to Coach Bowler's class and KJ. And Landon, you're asking about some more founding documents. Okay. So as far as that goes, let's note here that let's talk about the Hamiltonian Federalist numbers. Hamilton. You know, as far as that, you don't want to miss your shot at the AP government exam, right? Aaron Burr here. So as far as that goes, Federalist 70. Hamilton writes about a unitary executive, and this is kind of something interesting because I see this sort of playing out, currently right now. I mean, when you see a lot of the things that are going on here, in our government now, like you look at Attorney General Barr, where he's been criticized by Democrats, like, that you're acting like you're Donald Trump's Attorney General. Well, according to the Constitution, I mean, there can be an argument made that he kind of is. Now, not that he can't do anything, not that he can do anything illegal, but when it comes down to it, what Hamilton's writing in Federalist 70, he's responding to fears that people had about one person being in complete control of the executive branch. So the doctrine of a unitary executive, yes, there are checks and balances. You've got the judiciary can check the legislative, can check the executive. The legislative, actually, in Federalist 51, Madison writes out the legislative, because it was deemed to have been so powerful that has an internal check with a bicameral legislature. But there are no checks in the executive branch. And Hamilton is explaining that the executive branch needs energy. Okay, he almost sounds like the current president in some ways, but the executive branch needs energy. And so the executive branch doesn't need conflict within it. So when it comes down to it, Attorney General Barr, now this is regardless of your politics, that, part of his job is to administer the Department of Justice. Now he does that as President Trump's secretary, but also part of the Attorney General's job is to be the president's legal counsel. And so every member of the cabinet, like, they answer to the president, they serve at the pleasure of the president. And so when it comes down to it, the whole idea that, like, a cabinet official is independent, like they have an independent position within the executive branch, unless you're in the civil service, you're a few rows down where the president doesn't appoint you. That's not the case. So these people, they work for the president. So in Federalist 70, just note here that Hamilton is writing about how he's arguing that it's a good thing for, the president to be in complete control of the executive branch. Now, what we could do here is some people may say that maybe that's not such a good idea in the 21st century. Maybe we need an independent attorney general or something like that that's not directly accountable to the president. But Hamilton, he was writing about this idea of the unitary executive. So it's something you might want to think about as you're seeing some of the stuff play out in politics. It's like, should some of the executive agencies be a little bit more independent of the president and not directly, so, should the president be able to unilaterally fire the director of the FBI? But that is how our Constitution, as it is now, is written. Now, the next thing is the independent judiciary. Okay, so that's Federalist 78, where Hamilton is writing about the judiciary and responding to concerns. Now, remember that all four numbers of the Federalist, you want to be familiar with Brutus 1. If you're trying to go into the exam having not read any of these documents, good luck to you, okay? But you want to make sure, if nothing else, I would read Brutus 1 tonight, okay? I would look at it. I would look at the different things. I would print it out. I would annotate it if you haven't already, because Brutus 1 is providing like all of the arguments that the Federalists, that Madison and Hamilton are responding to in Federalist 10, 51, 70, and 78. So Brutus 1, remember, he said the judiciary is too powerful and the Constitution cannot be ratified, unless it's at the expense of the liberties of the people, that this is too powerful. Now, Hamilton said, and this is Hamilton. I mean, I sometimes refer to him as the greatest con artist in the history of the United States. Hamilton, he was looking for a stronger central government. So he said, the judiciary, y'all don't need to worry about that. I mean, this is the same guy that said you don't need a Bill of Rights. Like, nah, you don't need a Bill of Rights in Federalist 84. And so Hamilton wrote that the judiciary will be the least dangerous branch, that you'll barely even notice it's there. Now, Paul, I don't know about you. I mean, to me, it seems like the judiciary today is the most powerful of the branches.
Well, I don't know that I agree with the most powerful, but I think it's important to understand that when Hamilton and Jefferson, Hamilton and Madison, and let's give Jay some credit too. We're writing the Federalist Papers. They were looking at a very different situation. I mean, the unitary executive was really meant to be sort of one person, and then they could create some sort of apparatus because they knew there would have to be people doing paperwork and things, but some sort of apparatus beneath them. I don't think that anyone envisioned the kind of federal bureaucracy we have today, and I don't think anyone envisioned the type of cases that are coming before the courts today. I don't think it would have envisioned the amount of courts that we have today. But what scared the anti-federalists was that here was a branch of government, the courts, that were not elected, that served life terms, and that never at any point ever had to answer to the people. They were never accountable to the people in any way whatsoever. And that was the fear, is that they would have too much power. And in Federalist 78, there is the argument of like, hey, don't worry about it. They're not going to have this. What are they going to do? They don't have, it said, the two most important powers to actually do things. That's the power of the money and the power of the army. Congress has the money, president has the army. What do the courts have? How are they going to get anything done without the assistance of the other two branches? And I think it's fair to say that the power that the courts have today of judicial review exists and persists because the other two branches go along with implementing and sort of complying with the rulings of the court. If the other branches decided they were just going to ignore the court system, then the courts would become a trivial part of the government altogether. But the other two branches do respect the courts, and that, I think, leads to a stronger system altogether.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, I want to give a shout out to Miss Coleman's class. It looks like they are actually at school this evening watching this in class. So much appreciated. Wow. We've got some people. I mean, it says we've got about 475 watching, but yeah, we've got some watching in classes. Thomas, I love you too. Okay, I see people over there in the chat. So as far as that goes, and thank you for the follow, Audrey. That's been recent there. Michaela's got some questions here. She wants wants to talk about super PACs, PACs, hard money, soft money. Now, let me go ahead and address, it's the Citizens United case, is your Supreme Court case that addresses this. And so, you know, when we think about like hard money and soft money, and you know, McCain-Feingold, that basically, you know, soft money, this is this money that just kind of like gets thrown into the system. It's not coming from campaigns. It's not coming from, you know, the political parties. You know, that is more your hard money. And McCain-Feingold, you know, which was a campaign finance reform law, was trying to cut down on the influence of this soft money and these groups that just all of a sudden they swoop in and there you go, which, you know, somebody I remember called this at the time the Incumbent Protection Act, because when it comes down to it, you know, incumbents definitely benefit from, you know, stifling some of those voices. Like I'm not as much, I mean, there are a lot of critics of Citizens United, but the Citizens United decision basically says that, you know, the government can regulate, the FEC can regulate how much you can contribute to a campaign. They can regulate partisan spending. Now, they can also regulate conventional PACs, political action committees. So here's the thing. When I'm starting a PAC, I need to think about two things, okay? Now, do I want this PAC to coordinate with a campaign? So it's like, do I want to be able to get on the phone with the Paul Sargent for President campaign and actually coordinate like, hey, I've got this PAC and I want to run some ads that are favorable, and how do we best coordinate? Now, that is a conventional PAC. If I've got the option to coordinate, then my money, the contributions can be limited. Okay, so the Supreme Court saying anything that is either a campaign, a party, or a PAC that communicates and coordinates with a campaign, all of those can be regulated by the FEC. Okay, so when we go into super PACs, this is where, you know, I'm just like, hey, you know, I like Paul Sargent. Maybe we just haven't, you know, now HipHughes, I tell you what, I mean, HipHughes isn't able to be here with us tonight. But the thing is, I mean, I don't hear from HipHughes much anymore. He's, you know, going off and filming stuff. I don't even know where he is, but I hear he's running for something. And I'm like, you know, I like HipHughes and I want to support his candidacy, and he doesn't talk to me anymore. He doesn't come on this thing, but I still like him. And so I want to set up what's called a super PAC. I don't ever talk to him. I don't coordinate with him, but I'm just like, hey, I want to fangirl HipHughes and I want to say that I love his candidacy, but I'm not coordinating. And the Supreme Court ruled that that kind of activity falls under the First Amendment, that if I'm not coordinating with a campaign, with a party, and I am just using my own voice and I'm paying money and I'm collecting things from other people. So that way, the Supreme Court says that the FEC cannot regulate the contributions or expenditures of an independent organization like that. So that's what we call super PACs. Now, again, the super PAC, you can't communicate. If I made a phone call to HipHughes or anybody that's in his campaign, then I have broken the law and I'm subject to being regulated. But as long as I don't coordinate, then I can do anything I want because of the First Amendment guarantee of free speech. And so for me, Citizens United, now it does, you know, it does do something to the impact of this soft money on the campaigns. But for me, it just seems to be a very cut and dry First Amendment issue, in the sense that if I'm using my own money to support candidates or to put candidates on blast of my choice, you know, how can, you know, Congress shall make no law regarding, you know, regarding the abridgment of speech and whatnot. So regarding the freedom of speech. Now, Paul, what would be a good argument like against Citizens United?
Well, I first want to clarify one thing, because when McCain-Feingold was passed, what it did is it more regulated donations that were made directly to campaigns, and then it also took away this soft money. A lot of groups were giving money, say, to the Republican or the Democratic Party, and then the party wasn't really doing stuff for a presidential candidate, but they would do stuff for their party's candidate in a district. So it would list the president and then maybe like, you know, maybe a senator if they're up for election, and then a congressman, and then maybe, you know, like something like a mayor or whatever. And then it was a party thing, and that was unregulated money. And so they put a cap on that. What they then said is that groups could make advertisements and things like that, but they could not explicitly support a candidate. They made that very clear, that that was going to be the same as donating directly to. If I am limited in what I can donate to the Tom Richey campaign, then, hey, you know what? I'm going to make a campaign commercial that says vote for Tom Richey. But they know that that's not allowed. What was allowed, though, was the vote against campaigns. And so these groups showed up, registered themselves as what were called 527s, which is another group that you need to know for the exam. And they made anti-candidate campaigns. So they weren't saying vote for, they were saying this person who's running against the person that we like is a real bad choice. And that was okay. Then groups wanted to make the vote for without you know, going to the campaign and talking with it, and to be unlimited in their ability to do that. And Citizens United gave them that ability. I think the argument against it is that there's a great deal of likelihood that any group which is going to create some sort of ad or some sort of documentary or whatever that's in support of a candidate is going to do so, not, I think, with explicit coordination with the campaign, but I think there's going to be enough signals sent back and forth that if a super PAC is going to create itself as the re-elect Donald Trump 2020 super PAC, they're not going to be spending a lot of money advertising in California. But they may, and I'm not trying to call anyone out on any conspiracy theories here, but, you know, I think hints can be thrown back and forth that, gosh, you know, it looks like Pennsylvania and Florida and Michigan are going to be kind of tight this year. And then super PACs start funneling their advertisements into those states to support Donald Trump. And I think that the other argument against Citizens United is that it kind of opened wide the doors, and that by giving corporations, unions, and whatever else the freedom of speech, that it was treating those entities as individuals within the system. And the amount of money which has been spent on campaigns since Citizens United, or I shouldn't say spent on campaigns, because these aren't spent on campaigns, but spent on the general effort, has gone up enormously. And so those are sort of the arguments against it, I think.
All right, and so I've got a question about iron triangles, okay, and bureaucracies. And the thing is that when we look at the bureaucracy, okay, and this is kind of like, in some cases, you might look at this as a fourth branch of government, because the thing is that when it comes down to it, the legislative branch makes laws, the president issues executive orders, you've got court decisions and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you have a great deal of bureaucratic discretion, okay? And you see this, you know, not only in your real life, but also like on movies and stuff, where, you know, can't you do this for me? Like, this is at the impound, you know, there's a part like on Dude, Where's My Car, you know, where the car is in the impound, and, you know, you ask the person, you're like, you know, I know they're saying this is the regulation, that's that. And it's like, but can't you just kind of look the other way on this one? And so in a lot of cases, what happens is that person does kind of like, you know what, I'm going to let this one slide. Or there's that person that you run into at the DMV or like wherever else you are, that they are enforcing every little rule to, you know, to the T. And so the bureaucracy, like bureaucrats do have some, you know, kind of like, you know, when you think about when you get pulled over, it's like the police officer says, you know, you were going this at this speed, and here was the speed limit. And sometimes the police officer says, I'm letting you off with a warning. Sometimes the police officer says, well, you were actually going this speed, but I wrote you a ticket for this lower speed. And it's to the point where when the police officer writes you a ticket for the speed you were actually going, you're thinking like, man, what a jerk. Now, you don't tell him that, right? But, this person has bureaucratic discretion, just like where, they're not going to pull you over typically for going 2 miles over the speed limit. They're going to pull you over for going this many miles over. So the people who actually, and especially like, anybody that's a teacher knows that, when you're told that, oh, you're going to teach all of U.S. history or U.S. government in this year, and the teacher has to decide how they're going to do it. Is there certain stuff I'm going to skip? Is there certain stuff I'm going to go over? And so the people actually doing it, because you get a directive that's typically not possible in the time that you get to do it. And so that's something that you want to think about with the bureaucracy. And then also there's the whole thing with iron triangles. Okay. So iron triangles, it's like basically where the bureaucracy has this relationship with people who are elected officials. Okay. So for example, let's say that I'm a member of the teachers union. And so the teachers union endorses this candidate. So like the teachers union says, we are endorsing, Peter Paccone for state senate. And when Peter Paccone gets into the state senate, then it's expected that, we helped you get in there. And so therefore you are expected to do what we want you to do. Okay. That we want you, we want to make sure that you get, that you get some money. And so then also another kind of thing about that is when you start to see the regulatory agencies sometimes have somebody in the regulatory agency who comes from the industry itself. And so when you look at the influence of iron triangles, where these elected officials, they are accountable to groups that gave them money, and you start to see money go back to those groups as a result of that person getting elected. So in a lot of cases, that kind of, escalates, escalates government spending. Now, of course, we want to think about the Hatch Act, which, limits the amount of, how involved a federal employee can be. But I noticed there's even some talk now, and some people are saying, let's make Election Day a federal holiday, and it's almost encouraging, federal employees to be more involved. So that's something. Paul, what are anything that you would want to offer on the bureaucracy?
Well, I just want to show the maybe positive and necessary side of an iron triangle, since you took the problematic side of them. And I'm not going to say that they don't have their problems, but a lot of policy that's made doesn't concern a whole lot of people. So the example I like to use is the example of farm policy. It's very important to people who are in farming states or in farming areas, but for people who don't live in or near farms, farm policy is not something which is really big for them. And so if the people on the agriculture committees in Congress can agree with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who carries out the laws that they pass, and those people can also agree with the major interest groups who are representing farmers, then they can make policy which is acceptable to all three parts. The people who are going to make the laws, the people who are going to carry out the laws, and the people who are going to be affected by the laws. And if those people work together, then they can make a solid policy, and then it can be sort of voted on, rubber stamped by everybody else, and will become a law which is beneficial to the people that it needs to be beneficial to.
All right. And, and I think I've already shouted out to Mr. Bowler's class, but thank y'all for watching this evening. And thanks everybody that has come in and been a part of this broadcast. I'm going to take one more question, but I also want to remind everybody the Romulus AP Government Review app is available on the App Store and at Google Play for $2.99. Now, again, that, it's not fully calibrated to the redesign. That's something we're going to look into next year, but it's still a course. The redesigned course is still a course on U.S. government. Okay, so when it comes down to it, for $2.99, I don't think you can go wrong. It's a review tool that you can have on your, you can be, it's got a section on the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch, civil rights and civil liberties, parties and elections. And what I want to note going into this, I think in the chat there's some talk about linkage institutions. So let's go over real quick. Now, I've also got a video on my YouTube channel on linkage institutions, but these are institutions that connect people with the government, because I'm a school teacher. Paul's a school teacher. We've got our own things that we go through every day. And I don't have time just to figure out like, oh, let me go personally and see what's going on with the government. So these are institutions that connect people with the government. So those are political parties, interest groups, the media, and also elections, okay, which I typically think in terms of political parties, interest groups, and the media, because the election I go and vote, but it's like it doesn't keep me in contact with the government on a daily basis. So the media, for example, there are websites that all, most of you hopefully have been, if you want to pass this exam tomorrow, I hope you've been reading up on current events and current politics. We've all got sites that we would, we tend to go to that site every day or two and kind of figure out, okay, what's going on? This is a trustworthy source. This connects me to the government. Then, of course, there are political parties, which political parties are designed to help people run for office or to support candidates running for office. So if I wanted to run for office, I would go talk to, somebody from the local party if I want to get that party's support or run in their primary. And so that gives us a mechanism. Now, also, you have party meetings. So it's a way for people to connect. Now, parties, of course, are broad coalitions. In the two-party system, we've got two broad coalitions, the Democrats and the Republicans. Interest groups, that has to do with people who have a specific, typically a one-issue thing. So whether it's pro-life or pro-choice, gun rights or gun control. The AARP is a large interest group, okay, for people over 55. And that's why when it comes to like Social Security and Medicare reform, that's probably not going to happen anytime soon, because there is a very powerful interest group with a vested interest. And so this unites people who are like-minded, okay, people who are like-minded. So political parties, again, broad coalitions, whereas interest groups are, more one-issue kind of things. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, I've got another thing for AP Euro that I'm going to get on, but I need to go ahead and thank Mr. Peter Paccone, who will hopefully be on some more stuff next year. We were having some technical difficulties with him hearing us, but he's been helpful in the chat. And then Paul Sargent. Paul, if you want to give them one last thing about how they can find some of your helpful videos.
Well, one thing that I think this year I should point out is that if you go to the Bill of Rights Institute website, I did a series of AP prep webinars on their homepage. There's a link at the top for students, and you look there, AP prep webinars, and I did 9 webinars, each on a specific part of this content. So it's a good place to go back and look at some of that more specific stuff, which was really designed for people getting ready to take this exam. I think the most important piece of advice I give people the night before an exam is that you haven't been working on this for a week. You've been working on this for months. And at some point, you need to sort of feel comfortable enough to rely on the knowledge that you've gained over the course of the entire year. You don't have to know everything there is to know about the federal government in order to do well on this exam. You have to be able to use the knowledge that you have and the knowledge you've gained in order to put your best foot forward and write the best essays and answer the questions as best you can. And if you're tuning in tonight, it's for one of 2 reasons. It's either because you're nervous about what you do know, or you're hoping that this will make up for your textbook. And the second group, I'm afraid we're not going to be able to do all that for you.
All right. But then again, ladies and gentlemen, there is the Romulus AP Government Review app at the App Store and at Google Play for $2.99 if you're trying to get some cramming in, because I know some people are like 2 days ago, there's an exam coming up. But hopefully you've been preparing a while, and hopefully we've been helpful. And remember to subscribe to Paul Sargent's YouTube channel. And those of you, remember, if you're taking AP Euro or AP United States History, I'm here to help. It is always a pleasure, and best of luck to everyone tomorrow morning.